Of all the monuments of ancient Rome, the Pantheon is unique. Unique in the first place because it has never died. Unique also because it has survived virtually intact in all essentials as designed and built in the 2nd century by the Emperor Hadrian. Unique again as a feat of Roman engineering because well into our own century the Pantheon could boast the largest dome in the world. But it owes its survival to the fact that it became a Christian church. The Catholic Church had always considered itself the spiritual heir, the historical continuation of the greatest empire of the Western world. This building was to become the particular favorite of Raphael. Rome of the Church and ancient Rome came together in the Renaissance to create one of the grandest dreams that man has ever dreamed. Everything converges on this soil as in a theatre, wrote a cardinal at the papal court. And it was to Rome in 1508 that Raphael was summoned by Pope Julius II. He was 25 and he was to spend the rest of his life there. We have to forget St. Peter's as we know it now. To Raphael, the great piazza would have looked more like this. On the right is part of the Vatican. There are still fountains in the square. And Raphael would have recognized the famous obelisk, but in a different position. It stood a few hundred yards away, as it had done since the days of Caligula. Every day, from the moment he arrived in Rome, Raphael would have crossed this square, for it took him to his work in the papal palace. It's the most historic part of the Vatican, and for the rest of his life, Raphael's first commitment was to the rooms behind these windows, the private apartments of Pope Julius II. Raphael was to paint him at the very end of his career with unusual sympathy. Sword in hand at the head of his own troops, he had driven French armies out of Italy and brought rebellious cities to heel. He had stamped out the corruption left behind him by the Borgias. Il Pontifice Terribile, they'd called him, the awe-inspiring pontiff. Nothing and no one diverted this man of capricious temper and iron will from his vision of the Church united, powerful, and raised to a greatness it had never known. It's often said that the Renaissance became a secular age with secular values. The classical culture it revived was pagan, but the Church was always able to absorb it. The Church had its own truth and felt no sense of compromise. This roundel is in the very center of the ceiling of the library which Pope Julius wanted Raphael to redesign. But Raphael left the glimpse of sky overhead as an earlier artist had painted it. It was, after all, the vault of heaven. The unity of all things that the mind of man strives to understand, that was the symbol he gave the Pope as his trial piece, the globe of the universe itself. From the ceiling, the theme was to encompass the whole room. Through symbols of the four elements, it gradually expanded to a key panel at each corner. From the fall of man, we are led towards spiritual wisdom by the figure of theology. This was the first main fresco Raphael embarked on, for first in man's understanding of truth must come his understanding of God. Christ the Redeemer in glory among his assembled saints and prophets. In heaven the truth triumphant, on earth the church its witness. The fresco has come to be known as the Disputa, but the name can be misleading. This is no debate, but a grand assembly of those who throughout history have guided the church in the knowledge that is revealed by faith, and whose central symbol is the sacrament of the host. St. Augustine, the author of one of the great books on Christian doctrine, The City of God, is shown dictating it. Pope Julius himself sits opposite in the role of another father of the Church, Pope Gregory the Great, and he gazes towards heaven, for this is his vision of the Church triumphant. Raphael's first idea was to close in the composition at the sides like a stage set to give him perspective. He had never worked on a scale like this before, and he needed to experiment. The movement of this group he felt was too fast, and he added the figure in blue to slow it down. The figures in heaven had to float in mid-air, and at first he spaces them out to keep them lighter. But here at least he could draw on previous experience. For only 18 months earlier he had painted a fresco in Perugia on very much the same lines. That, in fact, had been the first time he had ever painted a whole fresco to his own design before, and it had been much smaller and much simpler. He had based his ideas then on a Last Judgment in Florence by Fra Bartolomeo. Now he allowed his imagination to expand in a series of huge arcs through space. Rome was a constant inspiration to think on a vast scale and in heroic terms. The challenge was ever present in the gaunt remains of the ancient imperial city. For more than 1,000 years they had stood there dwarfing the generations which plundered them for building materials and built their own small houses among their giant bones. The Renaissance was the first time people stopped being overawed by them and started trying to learn from them instead. They had more evidence to study than we have now. On the other hand, sites like the Forum were still half buried under centuries of silt and rubbish. The Colosseum had full-grown trees growing inside it. But even in ruins, the sense of size remained. The scale, the grandeur of the classical world was what haunted Raphael when he came to plan his second fresco. The School of Athens celebrates another aspect of man's search for truth. But this time through the power of human reason and speculative thought. Not only philosophy, but science, mathematics, even grammar and rhetoric are here. Nor are they all Greek or all from Athens. There is an Arab logician and a Persian mystic among them. Who to represent would not have been left entirely to the artist's choice. Pope Julius would have outlined the program with professional advice on details from scholars at the papal court. One of these may have been the distinguished Neoplatonist Pietro Bembo. Baldassare Castiglione was probably another. Both were close friends of Raphael's. Both have been suggested as the model for Zarathustra, the figure holding a blue globe who is looking towards Raphael himself. But Raphael was more than the interpreter of other people's ideas. What he could do as no one else could was to give flesh and blood to those ideas. He was first and foremost an observer of life and of reality, and of all the influences he absorbed into his work, the most important always was the world around him, the world of here and now. Throughout the School of Athens, for example, he drew on his own incomparable knowledge of Greek and Roman antiquities, but the memorials of the past had to be turned into the living testimony of the present. This is one of many antique likenesses of Socrates. Others are general types of the noble mind, to use, say, for Aristotle on the right, side by side with an actual portrait for Plato on the left. For Plato is Leonardo da Vinci. Raphael clearly knew Leonardo's painting of the Adoration of the Magi in Florence. He remembered a face from it and put it in his fresco, like an invocation to the master he revered above all others to be with him now in spirit, as he embarked on the most complex painting he had ever undertaken. It was from Leonardo he had learned how to express a complex of ideas in a unity of form. In this group, the central figure is Pythagoras, whose mathematical laws of harmony were joined to a belief in the transmigration of souls. He is on Plato's side of the painting, the side of philosophy and abstract thought. Balancing that on the right is Aristotle's side, the tradition of pragmatic thought and rational deduction. And here, demonstrating geometry, is the architect Bramante in the character of Euclid. Bramante had appeared once already in the very forefront of the Disputa, and behind him Raphael had shown a scene of building operations. It is a reference to the greatest contemporary event in Rome. This is the ancient Basilica of St. Peter's, the largest and most revered church in the Christian world. Pope Julius had had it pulled down. Bramante was commissioned to build a new one, even larger, even more splendid. He had already proved himself the one architect of the age fully capable of matching Julius's dream to rebuild Rome in the grand classical style. He understood the scale of Roman architecture. No one knew how to use the classic orders with more fluent skill. He had taught Raphael the heritage of Rome, and it was he who introduced him to the Pope. Here, still unfinished, is his new St. Peter's, intended to support a dome to rival the Pantheon on massive piers with huge connecting arches. They are the same arches which create the exhilarating sense of space in the School of Athens. Raphael acknowledged his debt by writing the date in Roman numerals on Bramante's tunic, 1509. But only a short distance away, another vision was taking shape at this same time in the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo allowed no one to watch him at work on his ceiling, nor even to enter the chapel. But Bramante was the papal architect and had the keys, and he let Raphael in to look. One figure at the very center of the School of Athens had not originally been planned. It is Raphael's portrait of Michelangelo, painted in outright homage to what he had seen. Something of the grandeur of Michelangelo's Sibyls has already crept into these figures in the third division of the room. They are called the cardinal virtues, those qualities by which man governs himself and the world of temporal affairs. Man's spirit reaches out to God. It applies the gift of reason to understand its own humanity and the nature of the world. It promotes the good by exercising virtue. But by the divine gift of imagination, it experiences the final link in the equation. Wisdom, truth, and goodness are joined by man's creative awareness of beauty. Raphael's fourth wall is presided over by the spirit of poetry. Perhaps because it's a more specialized expression of Renaissance taste, the Parnassus nowadays appeals rather less than the Disputa or the School of Athens. Apollo and the Muses are surrounded entirely by a gathering of poets. But to the Renaissance, art in any medium was poetry. The gift for which Raphael himself was most admired was that he made visible a poetic quality of thought. For the figure of Apollo, he clearly did a study from life, together with the Renaissance treble viol he is playing. Virgil may come from an antique bust, and there were many portraits of Dante. But the head of Homer refers to one of the most memorable of those discoveries which were always being made among Rome's ruins. It recalls the central head in the antique group of the Laocoon. It had been dug up only 2 years before Raphael arrived in Rome. The architect Giuliano di San Gallo had hurried to see it, taking Michelangelo with him, and they recognized it as a work already famous in antiquity. Pope Julius immediately bought it for his own collection. Another he acquired was the famous torso which so affected Michelangelo. Raphael rarely quotes directly from sources like these, but they run like a ground base through all his work. The most striking of Raphael's adaptations is the white-robed figure of the muse Calliope. Her original is still in the Vatican, known today as the Sleeping Ariadne. But for centuries she was thought to be the dying Cleopatra, and as Cleopatra, poets have sung her praises and addressed sonnets to her. It became a fashion, but it was set by Raphael's friend Castiglione. In such a court of connoisseurs and literati, Raphael was bound to turn his hand to a verse or two himself. Among his drawings at the time are 5 love sonnets, and for once he seems less than all talented. He even seems to have had trouble finding rhymes. They made an intimate circle of choice and cultured spirits, these friends of the papal court, and together they made sorties into the country and to Tivoli, visiting the romantic sites of antiquity. Nearby, they went to look at Hadrian's villa and discuss Roman art and architecture over a picnic. Pietro Bembo, Castiglione and Raphael were always of the party. As Raphael left his 20s behind him, we have to forget the familiar youthful image and remember him as he became, a bearded, brooding Renaissance aristocrat at the height of his powers. His friends were eminent men of letters, scholars, historians like Agostino Beazzano, and another writer from Venice, Andrea Navaggero. Castiglione himself was probably closest in spirit to his friend. Raphael portrayed him as he would have wanted to be known, the pattern of quiet but courtly reticence. Close to his family circle, Valerio Belli, medalist and engraver of gems. From the gilded youth of Roman high society, Bindo Aldoviti, a distinguished patron of the arts. Other patrons came from the Vatican. He painted an altarpiece for the papal historian, and the tone has changed from the religious pictures he used to paint in Florence with their sweet Madonnas. This is something less intimate, more public. The donor gives thanks for his life when a thunderbolt nearly destroyed his house. It provides Raphael with a passage of virtuoso painting, one of his most boldly impressionistic landscapes. A courtier among courtiers, he dwells on the refinement and sensitivity of the human face. Raphael was talking to his audience as a friend among friends. His references to architecture, antiquities, classical learning at its widest and most humane was the language of a privileged society, and moving in the circles he did, he revolutionized the social status of the artist. In the first of the papal apartments, he had expressed a vision of clarity and confidence. In 1511, he embarked on the second. It is like entering a different world. The frescoes in this room are about Pope Julius, and he is brought in to witness the scene. 2 of his bearers are artists, Marc Antonio, the great engraver, and behind him, very modestly, Raphael. Enacted before him now will be the punishment of Heliodorus. The story from the second book of Maccabees is set in the temple at Jerusalem and tells how God destroyed those who came to plunder it. The high priest is Julius himself. In the act of trying to loot the temple, Heliodorus, treasurer to Seleucus, king of Asia, was struck down by a mysterious apparition. A horse with its rider, his armour all gold, which smote Heliodorus with its forefeet. And two youths stood either side and scourged him, and Heliodorus fell suddenly unto the ground, and was compassed with great darkness. The city was consumed with terror, and all made supplication. Julius himself had gone into battle to drive out foreign invaders from the papal states. This was his answer to those who tried to plunder the church and defy the Vicar of Christ. On another wall, a more inner drama this time, the Mass at Bolsena. Again, a scene from history. A miracle of the 13th century when a priest who had doubted the body and blood of Christ at the Mass saw the wine turned to blood. The scene is Julius's call to hold fast and have faith at a moment when there had been a plot to depose him. Raphael has made the moment of truth inward, spiritual, and completely still. Contemporaries would have understood it as the poetry of his narrative thought. The cardinals loyal to Julius in this crisis had enlisted support for him from the Swiss. Julius decreed that from that day the papal bodyguard would always be Swiss. Even in so stern and solemn a scene, Raphael introduces a moment of tenderness. But the fresco is dated 1512. Early next year, the Pope died. The man who was elected his successor was a Medici. The contrast with Julius could hardly have been more abrupt or more complete, for Rome, for the papal court, not least for Raphael himself. Leo X was the son of the most famous of the Medici clan, Lorenzo the Magnificent. God has given us the papacy, he said, let us enjoy it. Unlike Julius, he was not a man of action, but an aesthete and a connoisseur who boasted he had been born in a library. He was exceedingly rich, he loved luxury, he collected objets d'art, he was proud of his delicate hands. The Renaissance had reached one of those moments of high culture that can only sustain themselves briefly at their peak. Julius raised it there, but under Leo it learned to be self-indulgent. He encouraged spectacle and theatrical displays with lavish scenery. The court applauded his taste for buffoonery and elaborate practical jokes. In all solemnity, they dressed up a court fool called Baraballo, who wrote verses, to have him carried in procession to the Capitol. Only Hanno the elephant panicked at the crowds and stampeded. It was the great jest of the day. The papal court became more shrewd, more sophisticated. Leo himself never doubted he was presiding over a golden age, and in many senses he was right. He was surrounded by men of high talent and sharp intelligence. This cardinal has never been identified, but in his cool aristocratic poise, Raphael epitomized the new regime. Scholars like the papal librarian Fedra Ingirami made the Vatican a court of rather worldly cardinals. He distinguished himself with a Good Friday sermon in St. Peter's, replete with classical learning. Unfortunately, he forgot to mention Christ. It was a cardinal who said to Raphael, "You have painted the faces of Rome's patron saints too red." "They are blushing," Raphael replied, "to think the church is led by men like you." They are the only hard words we are ever told he uttered. For the first time in the frescoes of the papal apartments, Leo himself appears. Raphael had intended this figure to be Julius. St. Peter and St. Paul come to the aid of Rome. It was to have been another allegory of Julius's triumphing against his enemies, but now it shows Pope Leo I halting the armies of Attila the Hun at the very gates of the Holy City. Some of the execution is given to assistants now. Fresco has to be painted on quick-drying plaster, and Raphael is under constant pressure working it on this huge scale. Yet he fills the scene with exotic detail. The Huns wear gold chain mail. Trajan's column gave him that, along with the barbaric war trumpets. A Mexican plumed helmet, for the spoils of the New World were arriving back in Europe. Echoes of battle scenes by Leonardo da Vinci and by Michelangelo. Raphael rises to the challenge of an entirely new subject, war. The theme of fire again on the ceiling of the room, and from his knowledge of Chinese and Persian manuscripts in the Vatican library, he makes God appear to Moses in a burning bush of oriental flamboyance. But on the last wall, his most revolutionary vision. It is a miracle by night, the rescue from prison of St. Peter. And here Raphael pays his last farewell to the great Pope Julius, released from the prison of this world. Yet painting alone never seems wholly to have satisfied Raphael's longing to create space that is tangible and real. This is a small church in Rome called Sant'Eligio. Raphael is believed to have designed it very soon after he arrived there, perhaps when he was only 27. Bramante may have helped him with this church. Architecture had an abstract harmony which attracted Raphael, and features like this window were ones he would often return to. From the Greek cross on the floor, the design is centralized, symmetrical. It is a plan the Renaissance brought back to church architecture as a symbol of unity and wholeness. Bramante had used it, for example, at Todi. On a smaller scale, his church at Todi poses the same engineering problems of supporting the thrusts and strains of a great central dome, which Bramante had set himself in St. Peter's. But in 1514, he died, and Raphael was appointed his successor. He inherited an almost intractable problem, for the scale of St. Peter's was gigantic. Indeed, he never solved it, though in the process he became a skilled professional. This is his personal copy of Vitruvius, the Bible of Roman architecture. He is said to have known it by heart. and the margins are filled with notes in his own hand. But other work besides St. Peter's was always pressing. He now had a full team of highly talented assistants, and there was a third room still to be frescoed in the Vatican. He could delegate parts of it, but the designs had to be his. A great fire is threatening to burn down Rome, but the scene is made more epic by being likened to the fall of Troy. Raphael, the architect, is meticulously and classically correct. The Pope, whose blessing miraculously quells the fire, he frames in his favorite window design. Classical architecture was to become more and more Raphael's particular study, his obsession. The Pope appointed him Inspector of Antiquities for Rome, which meant that all classical monuments came under his charge. All archaeological finds in the city were registered and their ownership approved by him. He decreed which marbles were to be saved and which burnt down for lime. He became Rome's foremost authority on its ancient past. But he was creating always for the present. Across the Tiber, away from the main bustle of the city, but on the very banks of the river, there was a villa. It had just been built by the wealthiest man in Rome, in fact one of the wealthiest in Europe. Next to the Pope, he was to be Raphael's most constant patron. Agostino Chigi was a banker who held the purse strings of nations. Pope Julius and Pope Leo were both his clients. The architect Peruzzi designed for him a sophisticated palace of pleasure. The loggia is not real, it is a painted illusion, one of the earliest examples of its kind. The windows overlooked the river, and originally the arcades below were open to the garden, with Raphael's fresco of Galatea dominating a gallery full of the scent of flowers and the warm air of summer. This is Raphael's hymn to love and sensual pleasure, the triumph of the sea nymph Galatea riding the waves among sporting dolphins and amorous tritons. In this breeze-blown fresco, Raphael discovered new adventures in colour, not only the iridescence of a Cupid's wing, but a subtle green he had not used before. In Rome at this time there were some artists from Venice, that great home of colourists. Even the warmth of the flesh tints has a sensuous Venetian glow. But Galatea herself is Raphael's Venus, his goddess of love. In order to paint a beautiful woman, he once wrote to Castiglione, I must see women of even greater beauty. You must help me to find the best. If I lack good judges and beautiful women, then I follow what I have in my mind. for I have a certain ideal in my mind. He had a certain ideal in life also. But who is La Donna Velata? Everything about her is painted with loving care. It is the richest and warmest of all Raphael's portraits of women. Her face looks out at us from some of his loveliest Madonnas. She is said to be his mistress, the woman whose name may have been Margherita Luti, but whom the legend calls La Fornerina. Just down the street from where he painted his Galatea, there is today a restaurant in whose garden he is said to have courted her. La Fornerina means the baker's daughter. Who knows? It is quite possible she did come from this part of the city, the Santa Caterina district of Trastevere. All we can be sure of is that Raphael, whose love of women was famous, loved one woman above the rest. By great good fortune, the plaster surface below the Galatea has never been painted over. Sketched on it are the faint outlines of a woman's head. And above it is the face of an old man, the scribbling of an idle moment, a caricature, Pope Julius perhaps, or is it a first thought for this head of Zeus in the loggia next door? We are still in the same building, but 6 years later, in another gallery again at one time open to the garden. Here, from Raphael's detailed drawings, his assistants painted the whole ceiling with a summer frolic, the story of the loves of Cupid and Psyche. Like the guests in the garden below them, the gods of Olympus sit banqueting and toast the happy lovers. Outdoors and indoors, garden and house flow into one another, for the ceiling is a kind of garden pergola against the open sky, hung with garlands, inhabited by gods and goddesses, aflutter with birds and cupids on the wing. The swags of fruit and flowers were the speciality of Raphael's young assistant Giovanni da Udine. But their realism is all part of Raphael's intention, to turn illusion into an entire spatial environment. Just once he did unite all his skills in one total environment, and that was a chapel. A memorial chapel commissioned from him by the same patron, the banker Agostino Chigi. On one side his patron's brother, Sigismondo, On the other, a tomb for Agostino himself, still very much alive. More real than painting, sculpture, the figure of Jonah on his whale. He wanted to spend more time on sculpture, but even this example was modelled by an assistant. He did leave space for others, but they were filled by Bernini a century later. His dome he filled with the jewelled colours of mosaic, and because Agostino was interested in astrology, the signs of the zodiac mingle with Christian imagery. For the centre of the dome, a Michelangelesque figure of God the Father, to be seen in perspective from below against a blue mosaic sky. He had not forgotten Michelangelo, and his Isaiah for once elicited the master's praise. The church concerned had thought the picture overpriced. That knee alone, said Michelangelo, is worth the cost of the whole painting. But Raphael's mind kept turning to environments and schemes of decoration such as he knew they'd had in ancient Rome. And what inspired him was not even above ground. Beneath the ruins of the baths of Trajan, excavations had kept discovering parts of the long-lost palace of Nero, the Domus Aurea, his legendary golden house. For some years, artists had been scrambling along tunnels and down shafts to reach it. Some wrote the date on the ceiling as they went down. These dark vaults were what Roman historians had described with bated breath. Waterfalls tumbling into marble basins, gold mosaic pavements, painted walls, all buried for 1400 years. And by the light of smoking torches, they found them, traces of ancient fresco. The walls were covered with whimsical details and enchanting fantasies. As these chambers were called grottos, the decorative style acquired the name groteschi. Impressionistic landscapes, perhaps from the very brush of Nero's favourite painter, Fabullus. And they had understood the illusion of perspective. Raphael adopted the grotesque manner and made it a decorative fashion whose influence was to last for centuries. This little room, barely 9 feet square, is in the Vatican. It is a bathroom for a cardinal with broad-minded tastes. For the decorations are mildly risque for a papal palace, scenes of amorous dalliance from mythology and romance, the birth of Venus, Venus and Cupid, the loves of Venus and Adonis, of Angelica and Medor reclining here in a summer meadow. Yet even as Raphael was completing these light-hearted amusements for Cardinal Bibbiena, he was already at work on a more tremendous setting, the Sistine Chapel. Many painters had decorated it before him, including his master Perugino. Botticelli had painted the Christ cleansing the leper. All round its walls were frescoes of an older generation, but by men Raphael had known and honoured. Perugino and Raphael's former colleague Pinturicchio had collaborated on the baptism of Christ. Overhead was Michelangelo's great ceiling, on the walls these frescoes of an entirely different style and scale. Raphael was told now to supply designs for tapestries to hang below them. It was a commission demanding all his tact and all his skill. He aimed at immense richness of texture. They were some of the costliest tapestries ever produced. The original patterns for them, the cartoons, are in reverse for weaving from. That they survive at all is amazing, for weavers had worked from them for a full century before they were rescued from the manufactories and preserved as works of art. But nowadays they are truer guides to Raphael's conception than the surviving tapestries whose coloured silks have faded and their gold thread tarnished. The cartoons are in water-based paint on paper. The healing of the lame man by Peter and John in the Temple of Solomon comes from the first group of designs based on the Acts of the Apostles. The whole set of 10 took 5 years to complete from the time Pope Leo commissioned them to the day the first of the finished tapestries were hung in the Sistine Chapel. In the very year Raphael was beginning his designs, this marble relief was excavated in Rome. Its subject matter is precisely what was in his mind for his second tapestry theme, the life of St. Paul. The seriousness of classic style, its Roman gravitas, sets the whole tone for his intended narrative. St. Paul tears his robe in despair as the men of Lystra prepare to honor him as a god with the sacrifice of an ox. The action closely follows this antique relief, which we know Raphael himself wanted very much to own. They are virtually life-size, these figures, and they bring a whole repertory of classical gesture back into the bloodstream of European art. The dying Ananias falls to the ground in the same archetypal pose that inspired Raphael's Heliodorus. And nowhere does gesture carry the story more clearly than in the miraculous draught of fishes. The nets which had been empty can now hardly be lifted from the water. Form, function, and meaning are one, which is why we call Raphael a classical artist. Christ blesses, Peter worships, Andrew is amazed. The narrative is complete. And Christ said to them, I will make you fishers of men. Raphael's curious, recurring image of fire. It is a mere detail, a tiny incident enriching the life of a broad landscape which stretches across the background of another cartoon, the Christ's charge to Peter. A landscape painted with love, Virgilian, pastoral, at moments astonishingly romantic. The 11 apostles after the resurrection meet the risen Christ. Feed my sheep, he says, and entrusts the keys of pastoral care to Peter. Sheets of mere paper have preserved for us some of the most majestic designs of the whole Renaissance. Curiously, there are very few surviving drawings for them, considering how prolific a draftsman Raphael was. Even this life study for Christ is only part of a larger sheet. But luckily we do have the full drawing in reverse. It's called an offset, printed off the first one by pressing them together to give the artist an idea of how the group would appear in the final tapestry. But in 1517, Raphael was commissioned by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici to paint a very large altarpiece of the Transfiguration of Christ, and in his studies for that, Raphael's idiom can be seen gradually to change. They are more dramatically realistic. The modelling of forms by light becomes more intense. A commission like this would usually have been shared with his assistants, but Raphael undertook everything for the Transfiguration himself. He seemed to sense that he was about to push forward into unexplored areas of expression. The painting is two episodes in one, the lower half a darkling, lurid, fitful world Raphael has never shown us before. The apostles lack Christ, and without him they are helpless to cure the possessed boy in their midst. The drama is pushed to extremes the Renaissance had never dreamed of. Michelangelo understood this world, but even he had not yet expressed it. For it is a world where noble certainties are suddenly racked with doubt. In the foreground, Raphael creates one of those unforgettable figures that sum up all the heroic grandeur he had learned from classical sculpture, but look forward to centuries of painting yet to come. And yet the epileptic boy is the one who instinctively looks upward. The power of Raphael's idea lies precisely in the division of the painting into two halves. Darkness below is transfigured by light above. And he took James and Peter and John apart into a high mountain, and he was transfigured before them. And there appeared unto them Elias with Moses, and they were talking with him. And the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became shining. Nature itself echoes the theme of the painting. A landscape in shadow is about to be transfigured by the rising sun. But without warning, on the 6th of April 1520, when the painting was all but finished, Raphael died. The next day, the Transfiguration was carried in the enormous funeral procession which bore him to the Pantheon, where he is buried. He had died, we are told, of a continuous and acute fever. That the body was interred after only 24 hours suggests it was something more serious, possibly a form of the plague. He could have caught it from long hours spent in underground excavations, in primitive conditions, digging among the ruins of ancient Rome. He was 37 when he died, and April the 6th had not only been his birthday, it was Good Friday. Pope Leo survived him by only a year. He was grief-stricken, for it seemed that with Raphael's death a golden age had come to an end. In some senses it had, but in another the age of Raphael had only just begun.